Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the Arab Gulf States Institute. My name is Steve Sesh, and I'm very pleased to be a part of this discussion this afternoon that will allow us to take, I think, a good, long, and incisive look at what is probably the most consequential decision that this president of ours has made in the 16 months in office. Certainly the repercussions are being felt across the region, and there's considerable uncertainty as to where this is all leading us, if there's a plan B, any plan whatsoever. So we hope we can unpack a little bit of this in the course of our conversation today. And in doing so, I couldn't be happier than to have two distinguished experts joining me for the conversation. And I will briefly introduce them to you now. I will be a brief introduction. We have the full details of their accomplishments in the little handout you got on your seat when you arrived. So if you want to fill in the blanks, please use that to do so. Oh, it's on the record, Tom. This is a public program on the record. To my immediate right is Dr. Abdulhalik Abdullah. We're pleased to say Abdulhalik is a non-resident fellow here at the Institute. He's also a visiting fellow at the London School of Economics and the chairman of the Arab Council for Social Science. Abdulhalik is very well versed in Washington. He got his doctorate from Georgetown and a master's from American University. He knows the ins and outs of this town and its political life as well as anyone. To Abdulhalik's right is Ambassador Tom Pickering, Vice Chairman of Hills and Company. I might also add that Ambassador Pickering is a member of AGSIW's board, and we're very pleased to have Tom as a member of our family. Tom had a wonderful career as a diplomat, 5 decades, served as Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, U.S. Perm Rep to the United Nations, Ambassador to Russia, India, Israel, Nigeria, El Salvador, and I'm forgetting one.
Jordan.
And Jordan, of course. Only a few places in the world have had the pleasure of knowing Tom Pickering, but we're very pleased to have them both here. Again, this is on the record. And we'll have a discussion to begin with, and then we'll open it to questions from the floor. I do want to say to everyone who is observing the holy month of Ramadan, Ramadan Kareem, to you all, and we hope it is a month that will bring peace and prosperity and calm to the region. And with that, and with it being May, and baseball season in full swing, I will observe the tradition of letting the visiting team take the first crack at the ball. So that goes to you, Abdulhalik. So my question for you, Abdulhalik, is this. We all understand that Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and many of the countries in the region were unhappy with the JCPOA because of the fact it was so narrowly drawn, that it didn't address the issues of regional adventurism or destabilization that Iran has been guilty of, nor ballistic missiles. But my question is now, why does your government, do you think it's better off, absent the constraints on Iran's nuclear program, than it was before, and with no mechanism in place to address the other issues that we find troubling?
Well, thank you very much, Barbara, first to host me here. I'm happy to visit this town again and again and again. Anytime. This is a place where I not only did my PhD and master, but more important than all of the above, this is the place where I met my wife here. So you could imagine how much I love this place after 35 years of marriage. So I'm very happy to be back here. And I wanted that the home team starts rather than the visiting team, but now that you have put me in the spot, let me answer your question, Ambassador. It basically boils down to the fact that the decision to pull out has good and bad side to it, but more good than bad, viewed from the Arab Gulf states side, from UAE side, from Saudi Arabia side. It has both opportunities as well as risks, but more opportunities than risks, and probably big O opportunities. And the way we see it, or these three capitals who welcomed it, they see that the glass is half full rather than the glass half empty as viewed from Washington and other places. And that is at least on three grounds, very important ones. The first one has to do with the deal itself. And that is to say that everybody agrees that this was a bad deal, and everybody agrees that there is a need for a new deal somehow. And I think the chances for a new deal is better with American exiting the deal. This probably comes contrary to the conventional wisdom in this town, and I am in minority on this view. But there was absolutely no chance, a zero chance, for a better, different, new deal with the American being part of the deal. So I think eventually Iran will come back. Eventually, short run, long run, eventually Iran now will come back to a new deal. And the idea that Iran will come back, the chances for that is greater. That's for the deal itself. And it depends on the negotiation with the European, etc. But that's one reason why the glass is half full rather than half empty, viewed from the Arab Gulf states' perspective. The second has to do with Iran. Contrary also again to the conventional wisdom in this town and all over the place, I don't think now the deal that the American has withdrawn is going to bring the hardliners in Iran. I don't think that is really a scenario that is serious. There is no way on earth that Iran today, Tehran, hardliners, whatever you want to call them, want to escalate with the United States of America. I don't think anybody in Tehran, hardliners, softliners, whatever liners you could think of, they can somehow tamper with this very unpredictable president that you have now. So they know this is not a nice guy. They know this guy means business. And so I don't think it will somehow lead to hardliners coming back and taking over, et cetera, et cetera. And third reason, very quickly, the reason from everything we know just a week after the withdrawal, if you look at Tehran today, it's a very confused Tehran, lamenting Tehran, angry Tehran, and one iota weaker Tehran 1 week after the deal, after American withdrawal from the deal. On the long run, with the sanction coming in October, November, wherever, whenever, I think Iran has to focus exclusively for a long time to come on financial, economic ramification for the deal for Iran. So it's going to be an inward, somewhat inward-looking Iran. If 2018 was a bad year for Tehran already, I expect 2019 to be even worse because America has withdrawn. A confused Tehran, a weaker Iran is a good Iran, purely from a Gulf national interest. Finally, and more important than all of the above, the withdrawal is going to change the dynamics in the region, the balance of power in the region, which is totally tilted to Iran's favor at the moment, and for the past 2.5 years since Iran has signed the deal. I think the balance of power in the region is better off now than it was just a week ago. And if just the threat, let alone the action of reversing Iran's influence in the region, is to be heard more and more, let alone the action of it, I think this is good for America. This is good for the world. This is good for stability in the Middle East. And of course, it is good for us. for us meaning the Arab Gulf states in general, the immediate neighbor of Iran. We live 100 kilometers away from Iran, whereas you here live 10,000 kilo away from Iran. And we know how aggressive Iran has become over the past 2.5 years. The way we view Iran is vastly different than the way Washington probably view Iran. And if it is, if the end result is a weakened, confused, whatever Iran, ahla wa sahla, as we say in Arabic. So the key here is, for these probably reasons and others, Ambassador Steve, we, or the Arab Gulf states, have welcomed it.
Great, thank you, Abdulhalik. Ambassador Pickering, and Dr. Abdulhalik raises an intriguing point, which is that there's a better chance of having an agreement, a better agreement with the U.S. out of that construct than with it inside. And certainly the U.S. has made the point, as it's moved forward on this withdrawal, that the goal is to get a better deal with Iran as a result of this. And certainly the Europeans and the Iranians have been working assiduously in this past week to try to figure out if they can have a deal that will be external to the JCPOA or somehow incorporate it, but be free of the constraints that Washington wants to impose upon them. But can there be a deal without the U.S.? Is that possible? Will it collapse of its own weight? Does the U.S. need to be a part of this? And will the U.S. allow the Europeans and the Iranians to proceed to a deal, or will it decide to throw a spanner in the works and force the Europeans to decide trade with us or trade with Iran?
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you all for coming, and Ramadan Kareem. There are a number of complex moving parts here that we've gotten ourselves deep into. The first point I would make is that I don't believe the arguments made from the Gulf are persuasive in terms of whether, in fact, this was a good move or a bad move. I think that three of them are very deceptive. One, better relations with the United States is an unobjectionable, uncontrovertible question because it depends obviously on what the Gulf states wish to do and think about how they will react. But let me just say very briefly, I think that getting a better deal depends upon what you're after and what you have in the way of leverage. Fracturing the deal now means that both Russia and China are out of the sanctions business and highly unlikely to get in. That we are in a position of having to use secondary sanctions to make the Europeans play ball. A ready-made process for Russia to drive wedges between us and the Europeans, not necessarily a glorious outcome as the question goes ahead. The fact that, that Iran is weaker is, in my view, relatively minor in terms of where Iran is. Iran will be much more self-reliant. It will be exploited by Russia and China and vice versa for trade, even if the Europeans are out and the Indians are not far behind. Three of the greatest powers in the world with significant economic potential. And they have nothing to lose, really, I think, at this particular stage. But even if they do, we know that China and India parlayed the last U.S. sanctions on the oil business into the fact that if they took a little less Iranian oil, they would not be punished. So we already have a precedent for doing that kind of a deal. I think, finally, the question of sanctions here is extremely important. If you believe sanctions were solely responsible for Iran's coming to the table, you should go back and look at economics. There were three factors in the economic sphere alone that brought Iran to the table. One was clearly the demonstrated mismanagement by President Ahmadinejad of the Iranian economy before the nuclear sanctions cut in. They changed the spin on the ball in our direction even more. But you and I have to know that it was the diminishing of the oil price that made the final nail being driven in to Iranians' coffin surrounding their resistance to coming to talks, much less working out an agreement. So the notion that sanctions can purely be responsible for, quote, a better deal, whatever that better deal is in my view, a bit of a chimera. And we need to look at the real world and the hard facts before we make judgments on these on the basis of belief triumphing over reality. I think it is also quite clear that, to get to your question, Steve, a deal without the United States is not, in my view, possible, because there is nothing yet to rally the other big players to go ahead with a deal. We all know that the Europeans are tottering on the brink of whether, in fact, they will do a deal with Iran, and Iran in the same way. Iran wants out of a deal the economic values it had counted upon under the JCPOA, even though Iran knew that the JCPOA, with the exception of aerospace, did not free up a single American firm to do business with Iran, nor allowed a single American dollar to be passed, if we could find out about it, without punishing the perpetrators, if I could put it that way. And as a result, they were totally reliant on the Europeans. Now, the Iranians have gone around for the last 4 months saying this is a bad deal for us, because, in fact, your Treasury in the United States and your State Department and other people issued no licenses since the Trump administration came in, warned the Europeans prolifically against doing any more business with Iran, and cut it off. So, in effect, they didn't get what they thought they were going to get out of a deal. Does that mean that the moderates and the hardliners have shifted their balance? I have to say, from what I hear from people who visit Iran, that that balance is shifting, and that quite clearly we have something to be concerned about with respect to the hardliners and running the show. So if, in fact, I am right that there were very few demonstrated U.S. national interests served by the deal, and fundamentally a number of them were badly served by breaking the deal, including the fact that we have 10 years to deal with the most important sunset provision, which limits the amount of low-enriched uranium the Iranians can hold. 10 whole years. Preemptive capitulation in the face of a 10-year negotiating window, even if people say it's impossible, that's what they were saying in 2005, is, in my view, totally chimerical, totally a crazy situation in which a president whose ego is manifest and clearly the major driver of his interests is taking us for a ride on this particular show in a direction which I find very, very difficult. And we only have to see a little bit of the North Korean pullback today or yesterday in the evening to wonder whether, would you buy a used car from Donald Trump?
Well, that's a question I'm not going to try to answer, but nor will I ask Abdulhalik to necessarily answer that question either. And I don't want to make you the spokesman for your government, Abdulhalik, but I am interested because your perspective is such, and it's so rich, and you do understand the thinking that goes on in the region so well. I do want to ask you another question about this, because I have a sense, and maybe I'm wrong, and correct me please if I am, that the governments in the region are so enthusiastic about the president's decision because they see this now as the U.S. stepping to the head of an alliance to press very decisively against Iranian adventurism in the region. And maybe it brings the Arab states together with their wherewithal. It brings Israel into the equation with its wherewithal and its resources. Now, you told us when we spoke yesterday, the one thing that worries you is the unpredictability of this president. In spite of this very tough rhetoric and this seeming posture, do you think that the governments in your corner of the world are persuaded that this alliance is something more than rhetorical?
Well, after listening to Ambassador Pickering, it seems that it's good to disagree with everything that he said.
I'd expect nothing less.
Nearly everything, but not totally.
Thank you.
But it's good to hear the other perspective, okay? At least you now have a chance maybe, or you have already had a chance to listen to the minority view. I know this town is totally anti-Trump and deeply hostile to everything he does, whether it's good or whether it's bad, whether it's a new car or an old car, okay? So I am in here, and I know I got myself into trouble because of you, Ambassador Marcel, but I like to play the minority view in here, and I like to say also that sometimes this president of yours, the most unpredictable, can be right. And in this issue in particular, I think he is right. Not only on these three issues, that there is a chance for a new deal, there is a chance for a more reasonable Iran now, not a more hardline Iran. There is a chance for a more balanced Middle East rather than a completely tilted Middle East to the Iranians' favor. I think these are good chances there. But I think the key word here is for us, and now for the Trump administration, and maybe even for the Israelis and for European. And the key here is exactly what you said here, Steve, and that is how to confront this expansionist Iran, aggressive Iran. If that's the case, confront Iran's influence in the region, reverse it, which 8 years of Obama, they did not do. 2.5 years of Iran, they did not do exactly. Iran did exactly the opposite. So if the new name of the game is not just the deal on the technicalities of it, but the deal on the politics of it, so if the new game in town is to roll back, reverse, confront Iran's influence in the region, I think if that is the only outcome of it, then it is good, because that influence is destabilizing. That influence is playing havoc. That influence is creating a sectarian divide in the region. And for the first time in the past 2.5 years, we see an American administration that believes in all of this. During the Obama administration, 8 years of the Obama administration, they didn't think that way. Europeans didn't think that way. The exclusive focus was on the nuclear deal. Now the debate has shifted to something that we have, or the Arab Gulf states have always advocated. You have to include Iranians' influence in whatever deal that you're going to have next time. And for the first time, we have the American administration next to us, which is good, and that's why we're happy about this decision. But the Europeans are also convinced of this. For the first time, even the Israelis are convinced of this, because they see Iranian influence just 10 kilometers away from their borders on the Golan Heights. So when you put all this together, our conviction, the Trump administration new perspective on the Iranian and the European, maybe there is a chance for Iran to moderate a little bit. Otherwise, without that stick, if you use Iran with carrot alone, Ambassador, carrot alone, which was the Obama, which was the European, they thought that, the investment is going to change Iran. Carrot alone is not going to work with Iran. You need to talk hard with Iran. You need to bark at Iran between now and then. And you need to use the stick, and the bigger the stick and the heavier is the better. That's the way we understand Iran. That's the way the Iran 1979 onward really understand the name of the game. I disagree with you totally. I don't think the sanction purely changed Iran's perspective, but I think the sanction worked, and it brought them back to the table. And they were so happy and jubilant when the sanction was lifted. So the sanction did work at that time. It was not just a minor issue. It was a key issue in changing Iranians' position on the deal and succumbing to the tough articles of the deal. So bring back the stick, bring back the tough talk that Trump is doing. Stick works with Iran, and I think confronting Iran is inevitable. Confronting Iran is necessary from now on if you're really into a better balance of power in the region, and I think this serves you just as much as serves us.
Could I just jump in here, Steve?
Tom, by all means, I'm beginning to think I'm
I
superfluous
want
to
to
this
say something,
conversation
Mr.
anyway.
President. I agree with what a lot of Dr. Abdul Khalik has said, that I think it's important to constrain Iran in the region. I think it's important to open the door to constrain ballistic missile testing in the region. I think it's important fully to clarify access to military sites, and I'll tell you why. And I think in the end, it's important to have a new agreement on top of the JCPOA to deal with the sunset provisions. And why would you destroy the basis for keeping Iran away from a nuclear weapon for 10 years and open up that now and undermine the sanctions regime and your capacity to get more sanctions with the idea in mind of a plan B, which hasn't yet been revealed? But we already see some signs of a plan B. Plan B will be no enrichment by Iran. Plan B will be regime change by Iran, implemented from the outside, maybe by military force, because I don't see sanctions getting us anywhere. But it's a great idea. The really interesting question was that at various times, both we and the Iranians flirted with a grand bargain to include all of these things. It was quite clear from the U.S. and the European side that we knew we would have to pay in the coin of weaker limits and monitoring on the nuclear program if we were going to get Iran to comply with a broader framework of constraints. It was just clear. Secondly, it was clear that the Iranians wanted a grand bargain for exactly that reason until the oil price dropped, which in fact made the sanctions into super sanctions. And they wanted the quickest deal they could get, and they knew to limit it to the nuclear question would be the best set of framework we can get it. But we are not constrained, and never have been, by the nuclear deal in opening the door. The Iranians, in fact, said on a number of occasions prior to our walking away from the nuclear deal, they were ready to talk about ballistic missile testing. They said they could limit it to 2,000-mile missiles or 2,000-kilometer missiles, 1,200-mile missiles. They were prepared to talk about limitations in that regard. Clearly, the United States, our significantly brilliant president, has wanted to walk away from Syria. He didn't want to negotiate with the Iranians over an end to what's going on in Syria, much less to engage himself in using pressure to get them off the Golan and get them out of the missile business in the Middle East, all of which I think are really important. So that's not in the cards. That has never been a Trump position. I'd love to see him do it. I think Dr. Abdulkhalik and I would agree on that particular piece because it's important. I think Yemen has not turned out to be a brilliant success. You know better than I, sir. And I think the door is open for something in the area. I also think that constant war between the Gulf states and Iran, incipient or broken out, is not a solution to the problem of the Middle East. With the greatest respect, I think we have to observe the rights of all the states in the region, which means that Iran can't trample on the rights of other states, but Iran lives in the region as like everybody else. And a balanced, secure, and stable Middle East is something the United States has always been in favor of. And you will get that, but I think you will not get that by not getting to the table. And I think the table is an important place to resolve that. And each side will bring its own leverage, and each side will bring its own ideas. But the longer we walk away from that, the harder the problem will be. And in all honesty, I don't think we do our friends in the group of Arab Gulf states a great service by encouraging them to believe that somehow the U.S. alone will minimize Iran, that it'll become broken up or small state or tiny partition places. But at the same time, we have put our weight on their side in an effort to solve the problem. We need to get to the table and work with that weight behind us to get it done. And breaking up the JCPOA, in my view, is throwing a hand grenade in the midst of a long-term effort that can build some stability in the region.
Abdulkhalik, I see you taking furious notes. I can allow you to respond.
No, I think finally we agree on something.
Absolutely.
Okay, we have some common ground, and I'm glad that we are inching in.
Yeah, I used to be a diplomat, so I haven't forgotten.
Okay, well, I'm an academic, and I afford to still go on in this. Look, I think on the technical level, this deal was has a lot of problems. The ballistic missiles, as you say, Ambassador,
Were
is
never
absolutely-
included. Yeah.
Absolutely, was not included, need to be included, and there is no way Iran would agree to it if the United States was in the deal. And the second thing is the inspection. The deal gives Iran 30 days prior notice.
No, 24.
Whatever. Okay, let's say
But,
24.
but let me
No,
let me just answer that question, because that inspection has to find uranium involved in any military site to be a clear breach of the agreement.
Yes, sir. I know
The
that.
UN inspection mechanism has been able to find uranium on the site of the Israeli destroyed Syrian reactor after the Syrians did everything they could to cover it up. And the laboratory that's run by the UN can find pieces of uranium as small as a decimal point followed by 12 zeros and a 1.
Okay.
That is so small.
It still remains.
They
You
have
need
terrific
on-site-
capability.
You need on-site 24 hours rather than 24 days
You can be,
in inspection.
you can be
You could
there.
have included that.
We can watch it 24 hours by radar and by
No,
satellite.
That's not enough.
Well, of
Sorry.
course it is.
However, no, it's not.
Because I participated in the Iraqi inspections,
Well, I
and
didn't.
I know what
I
I know what
didn't-
we can do.
I didn't, but I think it would have been much more of a viable deal if the inspection was 24 hours rather than 24 hours rather than 24 days. I stick that one, and I think very important. The second and the third one, not just the ballistic missile, the inspection fault, but third, there's these all hidden sites, military sites they call it, hidden sites. My goodness, God knows what is going in there. If you believe Mr. Netanyahu, which I don't believe, okay, he's
Good for
coming
you.
up with all these kind of data and files. or whatever.
Another
Okay?
agreement.
Right,
Okay, fair
duly
enough.
noted.
So you have exempted all these hidden sites, and you need to include them.
None of them are
Back
exempted.
again. Well,
All-
they are all military
No,
sites.
all of them
being
are under
exempted.
the 24-day maximum.
Okay, but the deal gives Iran the chance to do whatever it is doing at the moment, and God knows what it is doing. So trusting Iran on all these accounts was a bad deal. So these are the technicalities of it alone, okay? And we could go on more in this, especially the sunset clause. What's going to happen after 2024? God knows. It's opened the door to everything. And it's just 6 years, 7 years down the road. So we do have a problem with this nuclear deal on the technicalities of it, and there are more to it. But I think
I do think, with greatest respect, you should read the deal with respect to the inspection. It contains full inspection of uranium from the moment it is born in the mine until it is destroyed in the reactor, every minute. It contains full inspection of every Iranian facility. It allows access to any Iranian facility. The additional protocol, which was the international standard applied for all kinds of recalcitrant states, had no limitation on the number of days that could elapse before you effect an inspection of a military site. We got 24 days. We have the technical capacity to watch any military site morning, noon, and night. For as long as we want, and we had the capacity to deploy people around any military site we wanted to make sure, in fact, that things did not go on there
Tom,
until the
you win,
24
you win,
days
you
were
win,
there.
You win. I give you.
We
you
had
were part the
inspection
deal,
of
but let me tell you.
centrifuge facilities. Most important, we have total control of any imported item that has anything to do with the nuclear program. So, in effect, this is the tightest known grip that the best people in the world could devise to inspect Iran.
And I come back to say that this was a rush deal. Obama, in his last days, last month, last year, whatever year he won,
He
wanted
had from
this deal.
January to November.
He wanted this deal so badly. So I think you guys, with all due respect, or whoever was involved, whether you or somebody else, there was a rush to cut this deal at the last minute, and they forgot about so many technicalities of it. And I think we could go on back and forth in this issue endlessly for the next hour or so if you want
All
to.
right, let me ask you a question
okay?
then, Bob Pollock. Can you envision a deal in the future, a new deal, a better deal, that the U.S. The terms of which the U.S. would agree to that would also be acceptable to Iran, or is that mutually exclusive?
Yes, I mean, President Trump was very clear in his statement when he declared May 8th. He said, I am for a new deal, and I have given you guys 1 year to cut a new deal. So I think even this administration is for a new deal. We are for a new deal. Europe is for everybody for a new deal, other than this one deal. So the deal is possible, and I think the Iranian will come. Eventually, they have to come and sit down. Remember Rouhani, a week before May 8th, before President Trump's decision, they said they're not going to accept a change, a one-sentence change in this deal. That's what he said. Today, there is a different narrative coming out of Tehran. Today, Zarif has run to Brussels to meet with the European to say, okay, let's sit down like a gentleman and see what you guys are complaining about. So the chances for a deal, which was zero, if the United States still part of the deal was zero, today at least there is a 10% chance, 20% chance for a better deal. I really believe that, and the conventional wisdom that there is, the Iranians are not going back to the table, to the negotiating table, is just not true. With all due respect on this,
Just a brief question.
Yes, sir.
Would you make a deal with a guy who had a beautiful mansion to sell you, and you signed at a wonderful price, and the contract had no way to get out of the deal, but that this gentleman had the reputation that every real estate deal he did, he found a way to get out of if he didn't like it at some time in the future? Would that be your ideal kind of guy to do a deal with?
Well, here I think I'm not a businessman. I'm not a real estate agent or whatever.
You're a great scholar, Doctor.
You're taking me into area that I am not familiar with. But I think this deal, it could have been probably binding if it went through the Congress.
It was binding without going through the
No,
Congress.
it is not binding,
Of course
because
it
the
is.
president could easily nullify it, and that's what he did.
Well, he
So the
couldn't
Iranian
easily
again-
nullify it because it was a treaty and international law.
Okay, so it could have gone through the Congress and it could have been binding deal, but it didn't. So the president has all the right to do whatever he wants to do with it.
Not internationally, he doesn't.
No, even internationally.
No,
I mean,
no, he
this is
doesn't.
not the first case, and this is not going to be the last of the cases. This president, have taken
Don't tell me that.
I mean, this president have made a lot of stupid decision, if I may say so.
Afraid,
But
yes.
this one was his best so far, and I think the stupidest decision he did is the moving, the embassy to the Jerusalem, which I think is creating already havoc in the region. So no, I think we still think. Look, there is this deeply hostile Washington to the president, which is in return deeply hostile to everybody in this town. So this position is going to color everything this president do, whether right or wrong. And I think in this issue, you need to be more objective and probably reason more objectively. And for us, if it is a matter of the national interest of the Arab Gulf states, just as much as the national interest of the United States of America, confronting Iran is the fundamental issue from now on.
Tom, if I may, I would like to ask you a question about the president's intent here, because there's a couple of examples, if you will, of him barking very loudly. And then when the moment comes to actually inflict the pain that he's promised, he steps back a bit from the brink. Certainly the steel tariffs is an example of diluting, to a great extent, the impact. And we've heard the Treasury Secretary already say that there will be exemptions for companies who can demonstrate they've reduced their trade with Iran significantly without identifying what that might mean. Is this loopholes? Is this a wiggle room that you think would allow the administration to step into the deal if there were some indications they could get a better deal?
Look, I think that no one is against a better deal. Most people are against destroying what you have until you are able to put in place the better deal, whether it's an alternative complete or whether it's an add-on.
But there was a zero chance for a new deal if you already inside this deal. There was a zero chance in that.
My sense is that that's as wrong as my telling you there's no chance for a better deal, quite frankly. I think we have to go back and be realistic about this.
So I think we
I think
fundamentally
that
disagree on
the
this.
president's negotiating style, in my view, is quirky. It's based on New York real estate negotiations in which you already know your partner. You mass leverage, you make outrageous statements, you aim well above what the actual selling price is going to be, and then you settle for something close to it because you've exaggerated your initial requirements. That's not the way international deals usually work. People will negotiate a long time. There are only 193 actors. You have to get along with them. You haven't got the opportunity to change the world. In New York real estate, you don't have to deal with the next guy if you don't want to. There are 2,000 people in the business. They'll all come back one time or another. So my sense is that this is not a very effective way of getting a deal, because the president's reputation in New York is asking for too much and selling for too little. Well, why do you think he isn't showing his tax statements? Come on. It's not because he made so much money that he's embarrassed. Never. And so in this particular sense, if you believe the president has a new and wonderful way to solve international diplomatic problems by asking for too much and then settling for too little, then probably you ought to figure out how you're going to vote next. But it's a little like the case where, in fact, you're driving your car and it suddenly quits on the interstate. And you call the AAA because you have a AAA card. And they soon send a guy, but the guy they send is crazy. And the first thing he does when he looks at your car is pull out a gun and shoot out the 2 rear tires. That's the new paradigm.
Well, you know, you had
Please,
Mr.
Alcoholic, respond to
you
that.
had-
Would you?
you had-
I'm speechless.
You had 8 years of nice guy, Mr. Ambassador. You had a nice president for 8 years. That is
And I'd vote for him again tomorrow and yesterday.
well, he's not up for re-election again. Okay?
And that's too sad.
But I think we have gone through 8 years of Mr. President, nice guy, okay? And I think it didn't moderate Iran. It did not change Iran's behavior one bit. If anything, they emboldened Iran. The administration, the prior administration, emboldened Iran in a way that they have never seen before. It gave Iran a second momentum after 2003, the strategic blunder of invading Iraq. So this was a momentum for the Iranian to go into this very strategic region. Now you have a different president. And I think from everything we know, a year and a half later, I think we needed this kind of a break. A president that barks, yes, that starts with, a high bargain position, but at least this is a quite relief to us to have a United States which is much more determined, United States which is unpredictable. It's okay to be unpredictable with your enemies. It's not okay not to be unpredictable. This is a healthy unpredictability, by the way, and I think it is useful. You had North Korea, which was completely unpredictable, and it took the world, okay? Now they had to deal with a new, much more unpredictable president, and they came to their senses. I think that kind of approach, probably for the time being, maybe 2.5 years, maybe another 6.5 years, I think the world needs it, and our region probably needs it. So don't dismiss this president because we had enough of 8 years of Mr. Nice Guy.
North Korea is still unpredictable. Last night they said they wouldn't meet in Singapore.
I know that. We heard that. But that's just a tough position that they have
That's-
to take. This
that's-
is pretty much expected. Up and down is very normal. Eventually they will meet in Singapore, and the president probably will get a deal and the Nobel Prize too.
Okay, I can give you right now the Nobel Prize for fiction.
If I may, gentlemen, I'd like to ask you both a question about regime change, and because there's a very strong aroma in this entire discussion of regime change as a goal. And Abdul Halik, to you, I would ask you this: do you think the Gulf Arab states, who insist upon seeing a new policy direction for Iran, would be satisfied if that turned out to materialize, or will they say that's only a game, you need to change the regime because you can't trust them to sustain an honorable policy?
Regime change is probably the ultimate goal, okay? But it's not going to happen tomorrow. It's not going to happen a year down the road, or maybe even 5 or 10 years down the road. This is a very difficult regime that is that is here to stay for a while, okay? But it's okay to at least bring it back, because Mr. Obama completely wiped it out from any of his narratives before. So I think just to bring it back, it increases the pressure on Iran, which is welcomed by us. We need somebody determined enough and predictable enough to deal with Iran. So regime change is finally there, part of the talk, part of the objective, but it's really not something, it's easily said than done, Steve. And I think if it happens for whatever reason, whether because of the withdrawal or because of the added sanction and heavier sanction, if it happens, it will be welcomed by us. Basically, because the Iranian regime since 1979 is an anti-status quo regime. It is a sectarian regime by the very constitution. The article in the Iranian constitution is a sectarian regime. By the very constitution, it is a revolutionary regime. Revolutionary regimes always destabilizing status quo. Is that a possibility? Yes, we have seen, early signs of it. Minorities in Iran, the Baluchis, whether the Kurds, whether the Arabs of Ahwaz, whether etc. They just a year ago they came out and they really are very deeply unhappy with the way things are done in Tehran and with the sanction. It might even encourage it. So we are seeing signs of it. However, if it happens, it's going to be incremental. It's not going to happen overnight. So a regime change is a goal, probably. It's a long, but not to be expected on tomorrow or a day after.
Tom, any thoughts on
I
this?
agree with Dr. Abdul Khalik. I think I'd add 2 or 3 things. I think that the United States record in regime change is not a very good one. We have done a lot of them. I'm not sure I count any of them as really a success. The second thing is regime change requires, if you do it from outside, somebody inside who has really got a serious possibility of being an effective leader. That's absent from the present situation. It's absent from almost every situation where we've tried. I think that regime change is going to come from inside Iran, and it's easy to say and hard to see happening, which is, I think Dr. Abdul Khalik is correct about the long term. I think it will happen more rapidly if Iran is part of the international community than if it's totally isolated. It will also, I think, happen more rapidly, and I think Dr. Abdul Khalik and I would agree on this, if Iran is not expansionist, but minding its own business. Iran has not had a great deal of success in the Arab world. I would say that Arabs in Iraq who are Shia are not normally all subservient to Iranian rule. I would suspect some of that's true about South Lebanese Shia as well. And so I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that this superhighway from Tehran to Trablus to Tripoli is necessarily something that is an established fact that's going to remain forever. My feeling is that, as I said earlier, we need to find ways to push back against Iran, but to use diplomacy to turn that into a longer-term set of arrangements about the Middle East in which the parties will have agreements about how and in what way they perform in the region and who they threaten and who they don't threaten. Hopefully no one. But it seems to me, while this is also very long-term and not something I can put on the table right away, the alternative is constant conflict, whether it is kinetic or subliminal or asymmetric or whatever we want to call it. And to me, that doesn't produce any real benefit for anybody.
Can I just add one more note
by all
here,
means.
on this regime change in Iran? If you look at the past 100 years of Iranian history, there has been at least 3 big, huge regime changes every 40 plus years, okay? 1920, 1950, 2000, 1979, 80. So every 40 years plus, there has been a huge changes of regime in Iran. And to go, and if you take that as a precedent, okay, then come 2029 or something, we should expect some huge change. If you take that as your guide. However, so it is not all totally outrageous to think of regime change in Iran. We have seen upheavals time and again in Iran, and the latest one just was a year ago. Before that, there was another one in 2000 and whatever. So I think the situation within Iran always allow for this idea that regime change is possible with America, without America, with sanction, without sanction. So don't rule out regime change. It could happen today, and it could happen 10 years down the road.
Is it something that you think the governments in the region are actively encouraging?
I think from now on, you should expect American to encourage it and to invest in it. And I think we have seen at least a statement along that line. And I think from everything I know, yes, there has been some help going to the Iranian opposition, whether it's the ones that we know or the different minorities, especially the Arabs, the Ahwazis in particular. So I think it's a long-term objective. A few investment has gone into that to achieve that objective.
Okay.
And let me just say, I think our parallel investment in Iraq produced an untrammeled disaster. So be careful what you wish for. Be careful what you do.
No, we don't need the American to do it. I think the Iranian people will do it on their own.
But I think that's fine. But I
So
think the
don't
Iranian people
keep
don't need to be directed, controlled, invested in, or incentivated by the outside.
No, I think if you go to the Iranian, I think many Iranians would wish to see outside support, including American support. On it.
Including the wonderful MEK.
Dr. Abdul-Halik, if I may. Just go back, and I'll open it up for questions in just a minute. One more question I'd like to ask on the tension between the U.S. and Europe that's developed over this whole decision and the fact that it may be doing serious damage to the transatlantic alliance. Is this something that your government and others in the region would want to try to protect, or do they see this as weakening the architecture of national security that it affects their well-being?
I don't think, there is a bit of tension in there. There's a talk about tension between Washington and European capitals. This might, it is there already, but I don't think Europe can afford any kind of, to continue with this. It is probably exaggerated among those who are against the deal. The European on security, on economics of it, on politics of it, cannot break away from the United States of America because of Iran, okay? Economically, they have much more investment in America than Iran. Iranian is absolutely nothing, even with the 70 million Iranian, etc. potential is there. The security issues today with Russia in there, with the problems that the European have to go to deal with Putin, so that I don't think that they could afford to break away from the United States of America because of this issue. And on top of it all, this is a lasting 70 years alliances. It's not gonna be easily tampered with because of this little deal. No, I think that is brought up by those anti-Trump administration's decision as a scare tactics. It's not going to happen.
I think in the main you may be right, that faced with the question of do you do business in Iran or do you do business in the United States, the preponderance of business is in the other direction. On the other hand, flirting with this alternative is not just stopped there. It's an alternative which at some point will take us into further sanctions against Iran because that's what will force the Europeans in our direction. They will, in my view, fail because Russia, China, and India, many other countries, many small companies will continue to do business with Iran. And that in the end, we will then be forced into a position. Do we use military force to affect the outcome? We've tried that in Iraq. We've tried it in Afghanistan. We're still trying. We haven't got the capacity to affect the outcomes right now in those countries, but we're still engaged in large measure because walking away is harder than staying in at a small level. And my own view is that Einstein once said, keep on doing the same thing and expecting a different result is a clear definition of insanity. And so at some point, we will have to face up to that. To try the same thing with Iran in order to affect this better deal, this change that you want under current circumstances, and I'm trying to be as realistic as I can, is in my view something you ought to look at. That we've gotten into arrangements where we use military force to try to change a diplomatic equation, and we have no exit strategy. The same would be true, I think, of Iran. The question there would be, would an air war produce the result? The first thing people would tell you is, of course. And we know it hasn't in Iraq, and we know it hasn't in Afghanistan. Do we want to get engaged with a country of 82 million people, many times the size of Iraq? Is that something that we're ready for? The president has promised in his election campaign not to do that. Is that a promise he'll keep, or is that a promise that he'll forget? I mean, I have no answer to those particular questions, except I don't see a useful upside. And this is why I keep talking about the fact that we need to engage diplomacy more than we have. It is extremely important to do so. I don't object to using leverage. But I do object to the idea that we have artificial goals that are way out there, that are in large measure going to be determined by the Iranian people themselves, that somehow happen to be useful at the present time for political reasons. Donald Rumsfeld, with whom I rarely agree, used to say frequently about Afghanistan, are we creating more people fighting against us by being there than we're solving by being engaged? And it was a perfectly legitimate question, and I think you would have to answer on the basis of the results that his question implied that he was right in asking it, and the answer was yes.
Gentlemen, thank you for that. Round one is finished. We will now proceed to questions. I think we'll have a few of those.
Hi, Barbara Leaf. I'm with the Washington Institute. Dr. Abdulhalik, I'm wondering, in terms of the president's stated policy from last October, where he laid out essentially 4 goals that buttress a strategy, a larger strategy towards Iran, I wonder how you view his comments recently, a couple weeks ago, in a campaign-style rally in West Virginia about Syria and about his intent, his desire to pull out U.S. forces from Syria as rapidly as possible, leave that to other people to fight that fight. I offer Syria as this, in terms of this question, because it goes to the issue of what the expectations are from the Gulf countries, or at least 3 of the Gulf countries, as you noted, for U.S. pushback against Iran's regional penetration.
Okay.
Syria is the question, and yes, we heard that statement from the president, but there has been retracting and modifying of that position. I think the United States came from complete inaction during the Obama administration in Syria to now having boots on the ground, which increased the Americans' presence in the region. And it served the American good because now they have presence in Syria and they have presence in Iraq. For America to come back, for us, is comforting. It's good to have America back and not leave it to Iran, not leave it to Russia, not leave Syria, at least to both of these powers, global and regional. So I think people are happy to see the American back in there, and it is good when it comes to negotiation or settlement to have the American in there. And I think on top of all this, we would like to see more an Arab force in Syria too. Just because there is Turkish forces, Iranian forces, to go back to the table on the negotiation, you need also the Arabs to be on your side. And I think all of this is healthy. And you see that when the American moved in, it was easy to defeat Daesh, although it's not complete total defeat, but 80% Daesh has been, Daesh now is definitely on retreat. So I think it was a healthy decision for the American to be there and to have 2,000 soldiers to protect all of east of Syria. Almost, a huge size of Syria today is more or less under the American control. I think in that sense it will help to speed up the negotiating and have probably a peace in Syria. The sooner, of course, the better.
Thank you. Bushra, Marina Ottaway is right there, if you may, and then Eric on the end of that aisle.
Thank you very much. Hi, glad to see you. In your initial statement, in your first answer, you indicated that when you were talking about the signs that the U.S. pulling out of the agreement is already yielding some positive results. You seem to indicate that there is already a change in the balance of power between Iran and the Gulf countries in the region. Can you give us some example? Can you tell us where you read this change in the balance of power?
It's only a week now, so it's too early to really come up with evidence. But if you go to Tehran today, and there are a few people that we have met lately that came from Tehran, the mood is gloomy in Tehran, okay? The mood is not really celebration, one of celebration that the United States have walked away. There is doom and gloom that we already heard it, and there is lamenting, there is angry voices, etc., etc. So Tehran is not as smiling, nice guy, feeling good about this as it was. This is just one. But if you go to Riyadh, if you come to Abu Dhabi, today they are feeling much more comfortable, much more positive about it. This is just on the mood side of it, okay? Now, go into this 2 weeks, a month, a year down the road, I think we're going to see that this mood and this narrative and this feeling will be materialized more and more in places like Yemen, in places like Syria, as Ambassador Barbara have said in here. So I think it's already the feeling, the mood have shifted to the Riyadh side rather than to Tehran and its allies. And in this region of us, unfortunately, where it is a zero-sum game, any iota of change in balance to one side, it's a win to the other. So if this is weakening Iran even one bit, it is going to strengthen Saudi Arabia and its allies, strengthen it. So the balance is going to be tipped that way. A weaker Iran is good Iran. A weaker Iran means a stronger Saudi Arabia.
Could I just,
Please, Tom.
one swallow doesn't make a summer. That in 2009, there were 1.5 million people in the streets of Tehran, plus the Basij pushing them. And night after night in June, you heard from the rooftops, Mar bar dictator. Where are they now?
I understand. Could you elaborate?
Death to dictators.
Yes, okay.
Right.
Well,
Okay,
you know
Eric,
what we know for sure.
1.5 million people are not been in the streets of Tehran recently.
Okay, so it is.
And look, inflation is bad.
Yeah, of course.
Business is not good. But we haven't
Riyal
seen.
is down and everything.
Rial
It's
is
really-
down,
it's
but we
really
haven't
bad.
seen anything like we saw before when we didn't overestimate the fact that this was going to be regime change.
No,
Right.
no. But David Ignatius, in today's Washington Post article, which is very interesting, he called it punch in the face. And when you get a punch in the face, there is a pain that Iran is feeling at this moment.
And you get punched back.
okay.
We have to see it.
Eric, please.
Eric Polofsky. A question for you, Professor. Picking up on the thread that Ambassador Leaf raised, but starting with the baseline of now, rather than where we might have been or should have been or wanted to be. We have Brent crude roughly at 78. It's moving north towards 80, so people think. There's been public reporting about the Saudis wanting to get it up to 80. I think there's public reporting about people having an even higher ambition. That obviously rewards a lot of people, including Iran, including Russia. So my question is perhaps a couple parts, but it's in essence, if you take the fact that Russia and China are unlikely to accept and adhere to secondary sanctions, if you just, again, a hypothetical baseline that perhaps the Europeans companies largely accept because they need to preserve their relationship with the U.S. economy, and India tries to find a middle ground, but in effect continues its economic relationships with Iran in large part. And the fact that we've seen over time both Iraq in its worst days, Venezuela in its current days, the ability of regimes to sustain themselves over economic sanctions in a very long period of time. I come back to the question of whose stick. Because I think the stick that you described earlier about the need for a heavy stick and a need to really press down on the Iranians, and the fact that, as Ambassador Leaf raised, that there's certainly a dynamic inside the American body politic to withdraw U.S. participation militarily in the Middle East. Where do you think this goes? Whose stick do you imagine will be used and how?
The Trump stick, let's see that. But you know, the oil issue it's not the price issue. It is the oil production. Iran is currently producing 3.2 million barrels a day, and I think with the sanction and with less investment in the energy, I think this is going to drop. Iran was hoping to reach 5 million barrel a day of oil. That is now gone, vanished completely. Even with whatever dollar price of oil, Iran is not going for the time being to reach that objective, 5 million barrel a day. So we are now at a 3 million, and I think with this, energy side of the sanction, the oil production is going to drop probably to something like 2 million. Even if the price goes back again to 80, let's assume, or above that, Iran is still going to have a problem selling its oil to international market. The Europeans are going to be probably watching because they need to go along with these sanctions. No, I think there is a tougher time coming Iran's way. Economically, financially, they have to sort out the dollar transactions. They have to watch out for their economic well-being, which means less money going out of Iran for us, less money going to Hezbollah probably and other Iran's proxies throughout the region. Iran doesn't have a stick. It does have a market probably, and everybody wants to go into Iran. It does have a relationship with China, Russia, etc. But this is not going to change anybody's opinion when it comes to the fact that Iran is a destabilizing regime in the region. I think in the economics of it, Iran has already losing. And if there is a list of who is winning, who is losing already, I could put Iran on the top of it, on the top of the list who are already losing as a result of the American withdrawal from the deal.
Question over here.
Tom Lippman, Middle East Institute. Dr. Abdelkhalik, let's assume for a moment that your projections are more or less correct, right? Would you place Qatar in that picture for me and the boycott? Does it help? Does it hinder? Does it make any difference? I know it makes a big difference within CENTCOM.
What matters the most is the two countries in this region, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, for the United States and for confronting Iran. So Qatar is there, important, whatever, but the boycott has not changed American interest one bit. American interest, whether it's Al Udeid or whether it is the bases or whatever. Indeed, the boycott have helped the American, because the Qataris has relented to so many things that they would not have relent to. You don't need a united front, meaning a front that includes all the 6 Arab Gulf states to confront Iran, okay? You don't need that. You already don't have a solid Qatar. You don't have a solid Oman. You have a somewhat neutral Kuwait. What matters the most are Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, the 2 biggest countries, the 2 biggest military and the political capitals. As long as you have these 2 backing the United States of America, then the confrontation of Iran is viable, and it has the full support of these countries. Qatar is, as we have always said, it's an issue that is hurting the GCC indeed, but it's not going to hurt Americans' determination to confront Iran. And if the American want an ally that is strong enough, that is reliable enough, it's Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, more than the other Gulf capitals.
Right here, Michelle, please, if you would. And then we'll go across to the gentleman and right down the aisle.
Thank you, Jonathan Shanis. Thank you, Jonathan Shanis. You spoke earlier about what drove the Iranians to the table, economic problems, oil prices, U.S. sanctions. One thing that's very rarely ever mentioned is the U.S. secret negotiations in Oman, which culminated in July 2014 with the acceptance of the Iranian right to have a full fuel cycle. I mean, one can argue that after this was accepted, or some would say conceded, the rest of the negotiation was just sort of crossing the T's and dotting the I's. Is the sunset in 5 years or 10 years? Is this really about a rollback or a taking back of the right to a fuel cycle?
Look, we don't know what Plan B is. I think you're right. I think that there was a set of assurances passed in some fashion, both about permitting some level of enrichment and about regime change. And I think these made a difference in the Iranian outlook toward a negotiation, and that the process was ratified by the Omani brokered talks, which people talk about 2013, actually began at the end of 2012. They began slowly, but by 2013 they had picked up strength. And the question was dotting the I's and crossing the T's. And the first agreement, the partial agreement, which was signed in November 24th, 2013, got ahead of the other negotiating parties. And you remember, close to the consummation of that, we had problems with the French. U.S. did. But the next negotiation was envisaged as a 6-month dance in the park. It turned out to be 4 6-month dances, and it took a long time. And there were a lot of hard-fought issues with it. So it was not something that was foreordained by a few statements one time or the other. Complementing the question was the Iranians dropping their disinterest in bilateral talks with the United States, which complemented the U.S. as being willing not to permit a full fuel cycle, but to permit a very limited amount of enrichment to take place in Iran, and no separation of plutonium.
Right there, please, sir.
Yes, Paul Davis. We've talked a lot about the JCPOA, and we call it the Iran nuclear deal, and stopping Iran. I'm sorry, I'm a little vertically challenged.
You're welcome to stand up if you'd like.
And we talk about ending Iran's capability of making a nuclear weapon. Yet the short-term impact of signing the JCPOA was the giving or returning of $100+ billion to Iran, which was immediately turned back over to the RGC and or any of the other proxy forces that they've used for their adventurism into the area and increasing their hegemony. Reality is that any time Iran wants to, they have about a 6-month breakout from the time they stop and decide to make a nuclear weapon. So in fact, it is the economy. The European countries went into the deal.
All right, we're looking for a question here, please.
Okay. What is the impact of the monetary portion of it? Is it really to stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, or is it pulling out of it to stop Iran from getting more money to increase their ability to expand terrorism?
Well, the president said it was to stop the money. There's no question at all in my mind or in any expert, and you'll have to go head-to-head with Secretary Moniz, that it's a year to make enough fissionable material to make one weapon. That doesn't mean make a weapon. It means make enough fissionable material to make a weapon. There are judgments that experts will give you about how long it takes to put it into an explodable device, and then how long to put that into a deliverable warhead. So it's quite a bit of time. The second point here is that my own feeling is, from talking to the experts, that it was close to $50 billion of Iranian money, a good portion of which was already owed the banks who were holding it, or their creditors, so it couldn't be removed from the banks without paying off the creditors. I frankly believe that the Iranians were never hamstrung by lack of money for doing what they were doing in the Middle East. And I see no violent uptick in Iranian behavior financed by the money. Certainly, since they got it pretty early on, a year and a half ago, I haven't seen a violent uptick. The Iranians have managed to continue to be a formidable problem in Syria, but they were a formidable problem in Syria, and I don't see that changing. The Iranians have continued to support the Houthi, probably in a more serious way than they did before. But I'm not sure, in fact, that was a question of the availability of money so much as the availability of opportunity.
Bush, we got a question here in the second row, please.
Thank you, Ambassador Sesh, and thanks, Abdul Khalik. Good to see you back in Washington after all these years. And Ambassador Pickering, thank you very much for the very illuminating remarks on your side. I have a question on the role of Iran in the region, which I think Dr. Abdul Khalik mentioned, but we did not really go into it too much. And whether we, with the U.S. outside the agreement, whether in fact reducing or forcing Iran to roll back its intervention in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and elsewhere would be easier or more difficult. Recall that under the agreement, the U.S. was actually in charge of the sanctions regime and had 5 allies with it, secured by United Nations Security Council resolution as well. Now, with the situation as it is now, knowing Trump's attitude towards sanctions, as we have seen in the mentioned by the ambassador in terms of steel and aluminum, and more recently in terms of this company in China, he puts the maximum punishment and then pulls back. And here we can see him going into the sanctions regime with Europe, China, India, small countries and others, reducing their trade with Iran and getting exemptions. And the sanctions begin to at least crack around the edges. But more importantly, strategically, this would shift the power to affect sanctions to the other parties rather than to the U.S. U.S. will have very little control on some of these because it will be forced to give exemptions for fear of retaliation. So under the withdrawal of the U.S., I see fighting or at least opposing Iran's role in the region will be far more difficult because you don't have allies with you and you've shifted the power to control sanctions, or at least to affect sanctions to other parties, and the situation is much more murky at this point because the U.S. does not have international sanctions, does not have the strong allies it had before. Do you think it would become easier to push Iran out of the region or more difficult?
If you ask me, I say no, but I think you asked Dr. Abdul Khalik.
And I say yes.
You got your answer.
Short answer, yes.
Right here in the third row.
Hi, Lori Milroy, Kurdistan 24. I have a question for Dr. Abdul Khalik, and that is, what if all the U.S. does is end the JCPOA and is not more assertive in countering the expansion, countering Iran's expansionism in the Middle East? And I have a question for Ambassador Pickering. How do you see the impact of the U.S. leaving the JCPOA on Iraq where Iran has considerable influence and there is a contest for dominance in Iraq between the U.S. and Iran? Thank you.
Well, even if this is just a talk, rhetoric, narrative, for us that's more than enough. It's a relief. Even if there is no clear policy, if there is no even action of whatever, to see an administration, to see Washington, to see an America that talks, I mean, it resonates throughout the world. It gives this impression that Iran, there is this superpower that is talking about Iranian threat and thinking of rolling back. But then, look, if you look at this administration, this is probably the most hawkish administration we have ever had in the past 40, 50 years when it comes to Iran. Since 1979, we did not have a more hawkish administration than the one in Washington today, confronting Iran, trying to roll back Iranians. And this goes through not just Bolton and Pompeo and the president, but even James Mattis himself. He said it time and again. When he wakes up every morning, he sees Iran threat number 1, threat number 2, and threat number 3. So you have a consensus here with this view of Iran that it is a troublemaker, it's destabilizing. So I think for us, that's quite a relief. And if that is what it is all about, then it's good news.
The impact on Iraq, I think, is no different than it is in the rest of the region, with the possible exception, obviously, of the large number of Arab Shia who live in Iraq and who have an affinity and an interest in Iran, but not necessarily totally succumbing to a diktat. And that in some ways, obviously, they were our allies fighting against ISIS. So in effect, we have some measure of cooperation that still exists there that's important. I think for all the Gulf countries and Iraq and others, they have to decide whether, in fact, the destruction of the JCPOA, which is not complete, and may still continue with the Europeans and with Iran, although there are big uncertainties about that, is in their interest. One result of that is Iran is free to do what it likes. Others may argue, well, then it will have to run the risk of a U.S. war against Iran. Is a U.S. war in Iran good for the region, good for Iraq, good for the general outcome of the situation? I would say that it is not my view that is anything close to what they would really want to see in the region and where it goes. Would they like to see tougher restrictions on Iran in Iraq? Some would, some would not. I think it's a question about whether, in fact, there is a preponderance of people in Iraq who worry about Iran as a neighbor. When you live next to an elephant, particularly if it becomes nuclear armed, you have things to worry about. On the other hand, if you see that country being pushed back in a serious way with an objective and with the possibility of actually making that work, then it might be seen to be good. The real question there is, will sanctions work? Highly unlikely, given the fact that they won't be universal. If sanctions don't work, what's your next step? Your next step is to threaten war. If you threaten war but are not prepared to go through it, that's an even more disastrous result than if you threaten war and have to go to war, perhaps, in the end to try to achieve your objectives. But neither of those is an ideal outcome for the present situation. So let's wait and see where it goes. The fact is we have no real plan on the table we would like to see as the outcome. And we have no real sense, other than this illusion about sanctions helping to solve the problem, with half the world telling us, forget it, that's really going to happen. So I think it's a chancy and stupid mistake.
Well, just to add to what Ambassador Pickering has said, of course, the withdrawal has opened the door, wide open probably, for a possible military confrontation in the region, okay? Let's be honest about it. That's one of the risks. The chances of a war a year ago was 0. The chances for a military confrontation of a sort has risen from 0 to probably 15, 20% today. And it might even continue for more as we go on. So there is a chance for that. And it's just leaves the door open to Iran to think, does it really want a war? It's not the United States to ponder on this. It's not for us also to ponder. It's for the Iranian. Do they really want to have a confrontation, military confrontation in this region with all the troubles and problems that they're going through? Do they really want to test this president's determination? Do they really can afford even a limited showdown in the waters of the Gulf or anywhere else, whether it's Syria or wherever? These are the pressure applied on Iran. So possibility of war is there, and it's healthy. Let it be there, by the way. 5%, 10%. I don't think we are talking about even 80% or above 50%. It is going to raise tension in the region? Absolutely. It is going to increase this rivalry between Riyadh and Tehran? Absolutely. We are ready for all of this. We, meaning the Arab Gulf states. We have lived in this very difficult region for the past 40 years. We know how to handle Iran. We know how to handle wars. We've already gone through 3 different wars, by the way. If there is a 4th war, believe me, they are much more confident today to deal with it than in any other time in their history, too. So nobody welcomes war. Nobody wants more war at any time. Arab Gulf states are the least who really want to be drifted into the war, but the possibility of war has come back, and it is one of the deterrent against Iran, and it is one reason to bring Iran back to the negotiating table.
Your friend, Mr. Netanyahu, whom you completely excused, no, well, the gentleman you made some serious statements about with which I agreed, is a factor in the situation whether you like it or not. And it clearly is something that is now probably much closer than 15%. Okay. And that his objective is obviously to hold our coat while we do the fighting. And if that's what we get engaged in, I don't think you're going to escape totally. On the other hand, your involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan has been through volunteers and others, much less than what I think represents your proportionate share in population terms, maybe financially more engaged. You have a war going on in Yemen, which is a diversion at best, and something that is not moving rapidly to conclusion. I think there are real opportunities there, as I said earlier when we talked, that we should think about. And I think as friends, there is something we should be able to do about that. But I don't think that put it this way, your comfortable index with the present situation with respect to where it might go is necessarily totally justified by all the facts.
No, I think, if you come and visit Abu Dhabi, Riyadh, et cetera, and these capitals, I think you see them today much more confident of their resources, of their capabilities, of their whatever that they have at their disposal. They are not going to be now alone. They're going to be with the United States of America. And your friend, not our friend, Netanyahu, is going for the first time come on board, maybe much more seriously than any other time. But I think the balance has already, as Marina's question conveys, have already shifted to our side, even slightly, and we are happy with it.
Well, I welcome your comfortability in Riyadh and in Abu Dhabi, but I'm not sure the Netanyahu factor is quite so minimal.
Well, gentlemen, you've anticipated what I was going to make the last question. It came from social media. Oh, Lamia is here. Okay, Lamia Elfar. I was asking about Israel's support for scrapping the nuclear treaty, and if we could elaborate on what this means for the region in the sense of heightened collaboration between Saudi Arabia and Israel.
Well, perhaps I should take that one. Israel's support for scrapping the treaty at the top has been unlimited. It has gone through periods of aggressive promotion and extreme shyness. And it shouldn't be missed in the fact that very large numbers of Israelis from the intelligence and the military in the retired category have spoken out quite strongly about the fact that while the treaty has its limitations, it's better to keep it in place and see if you can fix it than it is to do it in.
Well, my short answer to that is, for the first time, probably, Israel is seeing Iran closer to its border than ever before, okay? And it is this what is worrying Iran. We have seen Iran closer to our border for the past 30 3,000 years. But Israelis are now seeing the Iranian just across the border 10 kilometers away, and I think this is what is alerting the Israelis. Our agenda is completely different than the Israelis' agenda when it comes to Iran. We see the danger coming from sectarian Iran. That is not an issue to the Israelis. We see the sectarian Iran is much more dangerous than even the nuclear Iran. The Israelis are different on this, by the way. So there isn't much of ground between us, and to call Israel Netanyahu a friend is just a mistake at this moment, and it is just going, and it's coming from Israel more than it's coming from the Arab Gulf state capital. So the number one here is that the Israelis probably is an important factor in here. And I think if we are to confront Iran, we have to dissect it or deconstruct it. There is a way to confront Iran in Syria, and that is the doing of Israel. We need to confront Iran in Iraq, and that's the doing of the United States of America, politically, etc., now after the election. If we are to confront Iran in Yemen, that is our doing. So we all engaged in this confronting of Iran where it matters the most, but the name of the game, once again, is confront Iran is back, and everybody is in this game.
Gentlemen, I thank you both very much. It's been a very spirited discussion. Thank you all for participating.